let this be our final season. Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a review of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe Season 3. This is the CGI series that's put out by Mattel Television, and it's on Netflix right now. And according to Netflix, this is indeed the epic conclusion of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And so I am going to do a non-spoiler review first, and then after that I am going to give you a spoiler alert, and then we'll talk about some spoilers for the final season, because there's just some things here that I can't talk about without revealing some of the things that happen. And if you are interested in this show, I highly recommend watching it before you let anything spoil it for you, because there are some actual surprises in here. And then at the end, we'll talk about how this is the conclusion of the series. And, you know, if you're an old-time Masters of the Universe fan like me, you've been here many times before. This is a very serialized show, and you'll need to start from the beginning if you want to watch it. And so if you like the series, I think, obviously, you're going to want to see the final season. And even if you've had mixed feelings, as long as you have more likes about the show than dislikes, I think, you know, you definitely want to see the final season. It is a very kind of middle of the road kind of kids show designed to be non-offensive. In my opinion, it's pretty average, but it is competently done for the most part. The CG looks good. The writing is, again, for the most part competent. It certainly could be better, but it's not really designed to be one of those shows that cuts both ways, you know, for adults and kids. It's not Clone Wars, it's not Avatar. It really reminds me more of Power Rangers, except it's a lot more angsty and cynical and not quite as polished, right? Power Rangers has been doing what they've been doing for 30 years now, and so they really got it down to a formula, and even when they get passed around between companies, they keep a lot of the same staff on the show, so there's that kind of institutional knowledge. Mattel Television is pretty new at this, and so they only had a couple years to do this series, and so it's just not quite as refined. But again, it's competent, right? And that's saying something, because there's a lot of kids shows that are very, very hard for me to sit through, like, you know, the CGI versions of Tarzan and Jane and Kong on Netflix are great examples of shows that just didn't work out quite so well. This, by contrast, is Shakespeare compared to stuff like that. This is a complete reimagining of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. The design work, and oftentimes the story is just very, very far removed from other versions of He-Man. This is designed to appeal to kids, and it very much feels like a lot of Power Ranger influence. They have their own cutscenes for morphine, for power moves, finishing moves. They even get the ability to summon Zords, and essentially summon Zords in this season. And they fight giant monsters. I mean, it's kind of Mighty Morphin Masters of the Universe, really. I personally definitely have some mixed feelings about the show. I just feel like overall, creatively, it just feels like everything from the concepts to the writing to a lot of the design work just needed to be developed a little bit more. It feels like, you know, something that was just taken out of the oven a few minutes too early. It needs to be put back in there and given a little bit more time to cook, you know what I'm saying? And so if you look at the trailers and stuff and you're like, well, I don't know if I want to watch the series. I mean, I don't think you're going to be missing out a whole lot if you don't watch it, but there are some interesting ideas in here if you're a fan of the franchise. If you're on the fence and you're like, you know, you're curious about it, but you are concerned about not getting your money's worth out of your $15 a month on Netflix if you don't like it. I mean, there is a ton of other great stuff you can watch on Netflix. So, you know, you've got Avatar and Legend of Korra if you're looking for action-adventure anime. There's a great anime series I just wrapped up called High Score Girl if you like video games. If you are a living, breathing human being on the planet Earth right now, you should be watching Sandman, because it is amazing. So there is a ton of stuff on there. So even if you give this a try and you don't like it, you can certainly find a lot of other stuff to make that $15 a month worth it. All right, so let's get into spoilers here. All right, so first of all, King Grayskull is voiced by Alan Oppenheimer, which is the voice of Skeletor most famously, but obviously he also did Man-at-Arms and Mer-Man and other characters. And so I just thought that was really cool to have him do that role. Now, King Grayskull here is obviously a much more cynical version of the character. He's different, but it's still very, very appreciated to have Alan Oppenheimer in a role like that. As far as the new stuff we got, I thought the design work was actually a lot better this season on some of their tech stuff. I thought the horses looked pretty cool. I also thought the new version of the Monstroids and the Talon Fighter looked nice, and I'm not saying I would rather have these over the way that those things are normally portrayed, but I think in the context of this show, they look very nice. I think they've really kind of refined the look of the show. This show's version of the Snake Men are in this season, and they're basically just armies of undead, mindless soldiers. And there are a few different types of them, but they are pretty much all easily defeated. But the CGI creates some pretty impressive looking armies. They're able to kind of replicate the same Snake Man over and over again. But they are basically just the putties of this season. They'll show up in repetitive battles over and over and over again. And so Mer-Man is in this season. I think his design is actually fine, and he has telepathic powers and these weird tentacles that come out of his hands, and he is this kind of fanatical follower of King Grayskull after King Grayskull turned evil. And so he just basically provides a few fight scenes when they get to King Grayskull's tomb, and he is voiced by George Takei. Unfortunately, I feel like that's a little bit wasted because the reverb on his voice made it so hard to understand. I literally just gave up after the first few minutes of him talking and turned on the captions every single time he appeared just so I would understand the dialogue. He was telling them that they were going to die in one scene, and I thought he was talking about dolphins. That's how hard it was for me to understand his dialogue. And Hordak does appear at the very end as a cameo, and this is the toy version. I couldn't find a screenshot of him. But he basically just teases that, you know, he wants to bring his people to Eternia and presumably to attack and take over. And he appears to Evil Lyn, who apparently has powers connected to Hordak. And that's it. That's, you know, it's just a tease for a future story, which I don't know if we're ever going to get. And perhaps even more sad, you'll also notice behind the Hordak figure is a Mossman figure who does not appear at all in this season. However, what I will say, if Mossman was planned and then cut for this season, I cannot tell it. Unlike last season, which felt like there were big chunks of story missing, this one feels pretty seamless. So compliments to the team on that. I would have really loved to have seen Mossman, but you know, at least you got what you got in these eight episodes. The real Orko the Great from Trala actually does appear in here. I didn't particularly care for this episode or this version of the character. The writing just wasn't there to make him into a particularly sympathetic character to me, and honestly, most of the humor was off as well. It was just kind of a weirdly silly episode to put in an otherwise serious arc. And Skeletor's henchmen are here. At this point, I feel like they've kind of gotten a little bit old. I mean, I don't even know the point of fighting them anymore because we know that the good guys can kick their butt. And they don't really have a whole lot of meaningful stuff to do until they team up with the Masters at the end to fight Skeletor. It's kind of disappointing because you would expect, you know, something really interesting to come out of the fact that they don't have to follow Skeletor anymore. And, you know, you would think Evil Lyn would take charge and do all this stuff. And instead she just kind of breaks down crying in front of Grayskull because she doesn't like to have bat ears on her costume. Ram or Rampage is the second biggest villain of the season, and there's nothing to really justify what they did with her at the end of last season. You know, it's just a continuation of that. They do say that Havoc can corrupt people and make them do evil things, so I guess maybe that's why she joined Skeletor at the drop of a hat. She does turn on him and fight with the other Masters, and suddenly start trying to do the right thing. In real life, of course, there would be consequences for what she did, but by cartoon and comic logic, if you change sides and go with the good guys at the end, then all is forgiven, and that's the way this show is. And then there's Skeletor, and so for the third time in recent years, Skeletor has died and come back from the dead in a giant hulking monster body with a floating skull. I hope this is the final time and Mattel can kind of move on and do other things with this character in the comics and animation. Skeletor does get the power of Grayskull and Havoc and all this stuff, and there are some good fight scenes between him and He-Man and the other Masters, and he does, somehow take enough power that he turns into this giant monster, make my Skeletor grow. And it actually has the face of Castle Grayskull as a head, which is kind of an interesting concept. But the thing about it is, it just felt like they made him too powerful for the fight scene that they presented us. And it just felt like he should have been able to just disintegrate them just by thinking about it, right? There's just no way that the Masters should have been able to even fight him. And so it just kind of felt like they only won because their name is on the show, right? So that sort of took the edge off of that a little bit, but it's still a neat idea of fighting a giant Skeletor. I just, give a reason why they're able to do it, right? Maybe they'd form a giant Megazord, right? If we're going to rip off Power Rangers, let's go full Monte. Let's, come up with, I don't know, maybe repurpose a version of Extendar as a giant Megazord to fight while He-Man jumped on him and grabbed the power sword and stuff or something. I don't know. And I just didn't really care for a lot of the writing. I could be here all day if I went through every single bit that I didn't like. But I'll just say overall, I just didn't necessarily like the direction of the series, kind of having this dark side to force to counteract Grayskull that can corrupt people, the idea that you can turn a character evil just because they used the wrong type of magic. I just feel like that's not a particularly engaging way to tell a story. It's a shortcut for, getting a character to do things that you can't find justification for them to do. It's like, oh, okay, well, they just used dark magic and now they're evil. And honestly, I just don't like that for He-Man anyway. I think He-Man shouldn't be a character torn between good and evil. I think He-Man is, the kind of one virtuous guy in the room, right? He's not really tempted by evil. He's basically trying to figure out how to do what's good. That's his struggle, how to do what's good and how to live with the consequences of doing that is who He-Man is. He's like Captain America. I think Revelation got it absolutely 100% right on that. And the fact that everyone on Havoc was just so gratingly annoying. I mean, they just turned into absolute brats the second they got Havoc in their system, just didn't help things. But I did find the concept that King Grayskull was the precursor of both He-Man and Skeletor to be kind of very interesting. He begins his life as a hero and he ends it as a Skeletor type villain. Was kind of interesting. Now, I'm not saying I want to see that done with that character ever again, but I thought it was kind of one of the more interesting things they did get out of the Hanknade dark side storyline that they put into this series. And so even though this series hasn't really been my cup of tea, I am glad for all the people who enjoyed it. And so the question is, what happens next? It is called the epic conclusion of the series by Netflix, and typically that means there is no more. And that unfortunately would make sense. We can look at the history of Netflix on canceling series. We can look at the financial situation they're in and how many projects they're cutting. We can look at the fact that other He-Man and the Masters of the Universe series only lasted 2 years. Yes, they did get more episodes because they were on broadcast television, especially the original because it was in the 80s and they had super long seasons back then, but they only did last 2 years. We know it wasn't one of Netflix's top viewership shows or anything like that, and I don't see any evidence that it was necessarily burning up the sales charts and toys either. In fact, it was pretty obvious Mattel was banking on its other versions of Masters of the Universe with a more traditional look over the CGI toys. Last Christmas, my Target had an end cap with Masters of the Universe Origins figures and some Masterverse figures too, right? And they sold hundreds and hundreds of those figures. I never saw anything like that for the new CGI figures. So, I mean, it was kind of obvious that Mattel, kind of was being very cautious about this and wasn't, kind of putting all their eggs in that basket. And I think hopefully, we all understand that and that the franchise is going to be okay, regardless of if this one series continues or not. There's a lot of other stuff going on with this franchise, including another animated series coming called Masters Universe Revolution, which will be the sequel to Revelation. And of course, plenty of toys have been announced, especially on the Origins toys. They're going to have a Eternia playset coming and all of this stuff. So it is a very successful franchise. This is just, one of those shows that probably just kind of ran its life that these types of shows typically have. That being said, there is that still image at the end of the episode. This is typically how they tease the next episode. And it did have a picture of Hordak, so one could interpret that as a tease for the future, or perhaps it's just what they hoped would happen in the future. But it also has all the characters from the series in the background, and also little drawings of people from Earth, which I assume are the people who worked on the show. And so it definitely had kind of this feeling of this kind of thank you to the fans, taking a bow at the end of the show. But I think it is possible that perhaps it might come back and, be renamed as a different series. It could have a follow-up movie. I don't know. I'm not necessarily counting on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. This CGI series was always designed as a smaller project with less resources that was going to reach a smaller audience. But I am glad that the more expensive, more hyped Revelation did reach as many people as it did get those viewership numbers, and will actually be getting its follow-up called Masters of the Universe Revolution. And I suspect that's probably at least a year out, maybe a couple years. It just depends on how long it takes them to make it. But I am certainly looking forward to that. And I don't know what else is next for Mattel Television. Is there room enough for another Masters of the Universe series going forward? What would that be? Would it be New Eternia? Would it be Sunman? I don't know. I just hope whatever it is that they come up with new ideas. I think I've seen the same ideas repeated between the comics and the animation enough. I don't necessarily need another army of undead snake men. I don't necessarily need another tragic Orko arc, or seeing Skeletor die and come back as the Incredible Hulk again. Let's move on and tell new stories. You look at the 2002 series, you look at the Filmation series, they were always going to new places, telling new stories, new ideas, meeting new characters. Let's get back to that, right? Let's be able to go to Eternia and not know what's going to happen next. That was always one of the big draws of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. All right, guys, that's all my thoughts. Remember, on Eternia, we don't say goodbye. We say good journey, because every destination is but a doorway to another. So until next time, good journey.